Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I am your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have with me for the second time Keith Weiner. Keith is a PhD. He is the CEO and founder of Monetary Metals. That's a leading authority in the areas of gold, money, and credit, and has made important contributions to the development of trading techniques founded upon the analysis of bid-ask spreads. He is the founder of Diamondware. That's the software company sold to Nortel in 2008, and he currently serves as president of the Gold Standard Institute, USA. And he earned his PhD from the New Austrian School of Economics, and that explains one of the major reasons that he's a guest on the show. He was with us a few weeks back. Thanks for joining me again, Keith.
Thanks for having me, Jay.
Really good to have you with me again. Now, before we get into the topic that I'd like to talk to you today, one of the things at least, is Paul Krugman's notion that it doesn't matter how much debt you take on as long as you owe it to yourselves, no big deal. Stop fretting, you conservatives. What I want to ask you about the Gold Standard Institute, Gold Standard Institute, explain to us what its purpose is and what your function is there.
So the Gold Standard Institute is a 501c3 tax-exempt organization under the IRS rules. I guess we didn't run into the Lois Lerner Tea Party stuff because I think we got our tax-exempt status in the middle of all that in 2012. But the purpose of it is to help educate and outreach to people to explain the ideas of what a proper gold standard looks like, and help them understand what some of the problems are with our monetary system. And I just, if I may, I just want to go off on a 1 minute rant. Mm-hmm. I think the argument that most people use against the dollar in favor of the gold standard is inflation. Mm-hmm. I think inflation is a tax. And okay, in a certain sense, who could dispute that? But if inflation is a tax, it's a 2 or 3% tax. Don't we have bigger fish to fry?
Yeah.
Is that the most important thing to put our time and energy into? And so essentially the argument that I make and we, the Gold Standard Institute, make is that actually rising prices are not the most important or most urgent issue. And we've got a lot of other things, including exponentially rising debt. So the debt doesn't just grow, it grows exponentially.
Yes,
and
indeed.
Government debt doubles about every 8 years. That's a little bit hard to measure because the government keeps its books using what's called cash basis. And without getting too technical, it is illegal, as in go to jail, if you run a business enterprise with more than $5 million in annual revenue, which is still well within the territory of small business. Anything larger than $5 million in revenue, you are required to use the accrual basis. Mm-hmm. And the government, as big as it is, and it's obviously involved in banking and lending and insurance and retirement funds and all these things that really need accrual accounting, uses cash basis accounting. And so the debt that it admits to is currently, 21 trillion or something like that. It jumped up $600 billion in Q1 alone, which is obviously an astounding new record, but that record will soon be beat. But it doubles about every 8 years. And then if you look at the St. Louis Fed has a series called Total Credit Market Debt Outstanding, which shows, not just government, but, all loans and bonds throughout the entire economy. And, at a time when, GDP grew by 900 billion, total debt grew by something like 3.5 trillion. And so the problem is we get a diminishing return. We borrow to increase the economy, but we have to borrow more and more to get less and less increase. Mm-hmm. So that's obviously not a sustainable trend.
Yeah, so it's not just the inflation issue. There's other issues that are even more damaging from this endless amount of debt. I just suggest to our subscriber or to our listeners that they go to the usdebtclock.org, usdebtclock.org. It's really amazing if you watch the numbers. It's in real time. It just shows the U.S. national debt, but all kinds of other very important off-balance sheet statistics, too, that it's just amazing. It's mind-boggling, Keith. You're right. It's exponential. If you look at the growth of debt, total debt in our economy, It's growing exponentially, and GDP, to the extent it's growing at all, is growing in a linear fashion. And I don't think you need to be a rocket scientist to realize that that can't go on forever. So, but Paul Krugman thinks it can, and highly acclaimed by the establishment. He thinks it can, and debt is just a non-issue. I guess Lord Keynes believed the same thing, right? So this leads me to the topic one of the things at least I'd like to ask you about and have you talk about today, and that is this whole notion that Krugman suggests that it doesn't matter. The whole, and I think most people are drinking this Kool-Aid, Keith, because we don't hear anybody talking about this anymore. 10, 20 years ago, there was still concern in the mainstream about debt, about living responsibly and paying your way. As government spend, you needed to pay for it. Of course, you and I probably believe the government should spend very little, if any at all. But given that, at least there was some sense that there had to be some responsible spending pattern to government. But with reference to that, you wrote an article on May 29th, posted at monetary-metals.com, and I'd like to really mention to people, go to monetary-metals.com to keep up with what Keith's doing and many things he writes about, but the products of the company as well. I'd like to talk about that a little bit. Can you help these? If we probably have some Kool-Aid drinkers listening right now. In fact, it's hard not to be a Kool-Aid drinker. We hear it all the day. Propaganda is in that direction. Help us understand why Krugman is really off base here on this issue.
So don't forget, you forgot to mention he got a Nobel Prize.
Yes.
Not only highly acclaimed, but he's a prize-winning economist. But
yes. Or whatever.
One of the curious things about all this is that even the conservative economists, we'll call it the Wall Street Journal camp versus the New York Times camp, argue that we can grow our way out of the debt problem. So they acknowledge there's a debt, but they say we can grow our way out of it. And so I keep asking the question, and I find I don't get an answer. And if you don't get an answer, then maybe that signals you're asking something sensitive, and you're touching buttons people don't want you to touch. Mm-hmm. But the question I ask is, wait, so there's a concept. I didn't invent this concept. This concept has been around for decades or a century or more, called marginal productivity of debt.
Yeah.
And that's what I just said earlier in informal terms. How much GDP do you add for every new dollar of debt? Mm-hmm. And that's been in decline since at least 1950, which is the oldest data series I've been able to get. I suspect it's been declining much longer than that, either back to 1933 or 1913. I give it a toss-up as to which of those two is the origin of that trend. Mm-hmm. Now we get something like 25 cents of GDP for every dollar we borrow.
Yes.
So, the question I keep asking, and I don't get an answer, is why don't forget the Paul Krugmans who are just, mendacious. I mean, I don't really think anybody thinks of him as an economist. I think both sides, his fans as well as his critics, regard him as a hack for the left. And hate him for that, or whether you love him for that, depends on whether you want the left to win. But I don't think anybody really thinks of him as an economist at this point. But there are much more serious economists, conservatives, who will talk about growing our way out of the debt, and nobody talks about. I posted a Facebook last week, and this just absolutely blows my mind. If you search for marginal productive debt, me and my name and my articles dominate the first page.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's not because I'm all that. I know where I stand in the hierarchy of how much fame and fortune I have relative to other economists, which is to say I'm not very high on the ladder. The reason why I can dominate the first page is because nobody else is writing about it.
Yeah.
They've essentially abandoned the field, and so of course a junior high football team could beat an NFL team if the NFL team didn't show up. They didn't bother to get on a plane and show up. So, of course, the game would be won by forfeit, right? Nobody talks about this. And as soon as you say we're going to grow our way out of the debt, and the answer is, but the debt is growing much faster and there's a diminishing return of ever more debt for ever less GDP, then you realize that argument just doesn't hold any water. So to your point about how can Krugman say, we owe it to ourselves, it doesn't matter. I like to hold up a standard, and that is, we'll call it the precocious 8th grader. So by the time somebody's in 8th grade, they shouldn't really have magical thinking anymore. Obviously, 6 years old, people believe that a fat man with a red suit comes down a chimney full of soot and, leaves presents and stuff. And they believe in the tooth fairy and all those things. But by 8th grade, all that stuff should be gone, and they should be able to more or less think. Obviously, they're not educated, and they still have a lot to learn. But they should be able to, see certain things. And I think any precocious 8th grader could see that you just can't get something for nothing. There's no such thing as a free lunch. Mm-hmm. And that's what that amounts to say, well, we owe it to ourselves. That basically means let's just borrow infinite, and there's no problem because we owe it to ourselves. And you should be able to see it just at a very common sense level. Something's wrong. There's no such thing as infinite free lunch. Now, maybe it takes a PhD in economics, maybe it doesn't, to figure out where that so-called free lunch is really being paid for. But the fact that there's no such thing as a free lunch, I think by the age of 13 or 14, anybody should be able to see that it ain't so.
Well, I would suggest that maybe the 8th grader could think more clearly about that than the PhD economist, because he's been led to believe, he's been indoctrinated with Keynesian economics or some form of some theory that has nothing to do with anything, but he passed his exam and he got his degree from Harvard, Princeton, or Yale by saying that, and how could anybody question
that the problem isn't what they know, but what they know isn't so?
Right. So, actually, I would like to perhaps have you talk a little bit about the example that you gave in the small agricultural economy in your, and again suggest to our listeners that they go to Keith's website, the website to read this article and many others. And I think, Keith, you write at least a couple of times a week, right? 2 or 3 times a week you write articles, maybe more often than that. I don't know.
It's typically at least once a week, and then sometimes more depending on what's going on topically or otherwise. Well, it's a big commitment to write. It's like a lot of...
It takes a lot of work. Yeah, it does. It does. Yes, it does. And so that's why people should go there and read it, monetarymetals.com. But on May 29th, you wrote an article providing a simplistic example of why this just isn't true, that you can't just issue infinite amounts of debt and it doesn't matter. You showed exactly why it does matter, and I'm wondering if maybe you could relate that story. I mean, the story starts out with I guess Joe lends some seed to Bill, who is a deadbeat borrower essentially. But would you care to go through that story a little bit now?
Yeah, sure. Putting myself in the interesting position, I'm going to probably botch my own story. And just have to say it's better in the reading than in the telling.
Yeah, well, the reading is obviously, if people take the time to read it, I think it just clarifies and shows why Krugman his logic is just completely false. But go ahead and.
So you see, I have a farmer who in a simple agrarian economy wants to fallow his field, which to let it replenish and plant. I think in my example was. Beans or peas or something like that. I don't remember what the example was. Clover, clover, right, for the cows or the horses. He all this seed, to plant wheat, but obviously he's not going to need it that year. And rather than keep it for a whole year, in which a lot of the seeds get off, plus he can earn some interest, he lends it to
Bill.
Bill lends it to Joe, or Joe lends it to Bill, I don't remember.
Yeah, Joe lent it to Bill, and he was going to get 10% more seed back at the end of the year, because Bill would take the seed and plant it in the ground, have a crop, and be able to return the seed plus 10% to Joe, and then Joe would be able to let his horses graze on the clover and enrich the soil that year through the crop of clover. But then something happens when Bill gets the seed, he doesn't act responsibly, right?
Right. He just feasts on it because, of course, seed for wheat is wheat.
Yes.
He just feasts and eats it. Now, unbeknownst to Bill, the lender, that Joe is doing this, Bill borrows from an old retired guy gold to build a new threshing barn. And that's going to increase his productivity. He's anticipating a bigger harvest, obviously, with his soil more fertile and 10% more seed besides. He's going to get a much bigger harvest, so he's going to need a new barn, in which to thresh it. So he borrows the gold to build the barn, and then lo and behold, Joe doesn't.
Joe does.
Bill.
He doesn't repay because he's consumed the seed. Yeah.
Right, and so this is my definition of inflation. By the way, it's not increasing quantity of money. It's a counterfeiting or a monetary fraud. So by borrowing this to eat, he commits a fraud and says, "I'll pay you back plus 10%," but actually he has neither the means nor the intent to do that. And so obviously, this poor farmer has now borrowed to build this barn. He's not going to pay, so that means the old man in retirement is now screwed out of his retirement, and he's going to have to tighten his belt. Obviously, the borrower is going to have to tighten his belt, and unfortunately, the farmer is going to have to tighten his belt because he's traded away seed, which is a perfectly good capital asset in that economy, and gotten a barn which he now doesn't need. And so everybody is worse off than they were before. Even though, obviously everything settles, the debt's default and the credit is wiped away and everybody, the farmer is even, right? He gets an asset without paying for it, but he loses another asset without being paid. But he's traded an asset that was a productive asset for another asset which is unproductive. And so we see in this example, the retiree is screwed. He may starve. The farmer now has a malinvestment. That's what the Austrian school would call that. And everybody's worse off. Yeah. And this is precisely, I tried to be as fair as possible to Krugman in we owe it to ourselves. And this was a tiny little community in which 3 or 4 people, had a little chain of debt going, and yet they're all screwed in the end.
Yeah. Arthur, the older guy who couldn't really work too much anymore, but he was responsible through his life, saved his money, had a hoard of gold, and he lent it out, and then he loses it too because of this deadbeat. But let me ask you this, Keith. If Bill, who borrowed the seed initially, had done what he's supposed to do, there wouldn't have been a problem, right?
That's right. Joe would have been repaid to plus the 10%. He would have planted.
Or of course, there could have been a weather event or something that destroyed his crop, and he couldn't have returned it too. That's another possibility. The point is that in the real world, things happen that are less than. This is a less than perfect world. So whether or not it was intentional on Bill's part, or whether he just decided to, say the hell with the borrower, I don't care what happens to him. I'm going to just enjoy life and go for all the gusto while I can, and I don't care about tomorrow. Or sometimes just things happen that are beyond your control as well. The point is that if it's done on credit like this, your point is well taken. Here's the Bill who lends Joe, I should say, who lends to Bill. And Joe has, both his assets and liabilities are wiped out. So, as you say, everybody is worse off in this extreme simplified case, of course. But you also point out then that, in a larger economy, a lot of things can go right for quite a while and keep the game going seemingly for quite a while, right?
Yes, Adam Smith, who said there's a lot of ruin in a nation. And I think about stuff like this when I think about that quote. That sure, okay, you have people that are committing fraud and they're cheating, and the fact that the entire system doesn't blow up doesn't mean that cheating is okay. We cheat ourselves and therefore it's fine, to paraphrase Krugman, but it just means, okay, we're really rich, we've accumulated capital over many centuries, it doesn't all go bye-bye in one instant. It takes a lot of time, fortunately or unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay, so how does this thing, I think you can very easily relate this simplified story to what happened to us in 2008, 2009. At least it seems like that to me. And how does this thing ultimately play out? Now, we've had cycle after cycle in which the Federal Reserve and the central banks around the world have never allowed equilibrium to be restored, right? And how does this thing ultimately play out, Keith? Do you see the fires of inflation, an inflationary explosion ultimately because more money has to be printed faster and faster? Or do we go through some sort of a hellish debt implosion, 2008, 2009 squared or cubed?
Yeah, what's going on is borrowing without the means or intent to repay. And so the debtors are getting squeezed. Eventually they default, and then when the defaults happen in earnest, you get a 2008, and then the central banks quash it, and they do all kinds of crazy, unprecedented measures. One of the things that particularly got me in 2009 was they altered centuries of bankruptcy law, and they reordered the priority of different creditors. And they said, okay, well, the unions will come ahead of the bondholders, and I think even in secured bondholders. And so, this does huge damage to our, the fabric of our civilization, ultimately.
Absolutely.
But at the end of the day, this idea that we have to borrow more and more to get a diminishing return of less and less GDP leads to what I call the economic heat death, or the heat death of the economic universe. That you get to a point where the whole thing can't be sustained anymore. And, whether that's hyperinflation and prices go to infinity, or whether it's a hyperdeflation and nobody has any money, and so prices collapse, but it doesn't do you any good that a coffee is a penny because you haven't got a penny, doesn't really matter. The bottom line is things become very scarce. We destroy productive capacity by artificially and perversely incentivizing people to be producing things for which there isn't real demand, and to stop producing things for which there is. Mm-hmm. So that's what the Fed does whenever it centrally plans, is it distorts what activities are profitable and which activities are unprofitable. And so the unprofitable ones obviously cease, but those were activities that were economically important, and then other activities become profitable that shouldn't. And, so you have lots of, high-end hotels and booze and Ferraris and all these things, because the people that have money to spend right now are the ones that are speculating on assets,
right?
Particularly with leverage. But at the moment, people think we have a rising interest rate trend. We'll see where that goes. I'm on record as saying that the trend remains falling. This is just a correction. Mm-hmm. But if interest rates really rise, then obviously the cost of carry for all these speculations rises, and that's going to cause... I just saw a graph last week, I don't remember who posted it now, that showed net margin debt in brokerage accounts in the New York Stock Exchange. And it was terrifying because we have the greatest net margin debt ever. That is, everybody is all in borrowing to bet on asset prices.
Mm-hmm.
And so
one-way street.
Obviously, if asset prices reverse, then the margin calls, begin to come in. And, what had been a lot of fun on the way up becomes a lot of pain on the way down.
Terror.
But at the end of the day, right, again, back to the 8th grader, I think any 8th grader can tell you can't print real wealth. And so if people think that the Fed can somehow make us all wealthier, and that's effectively what most people believe. They believe it.
Yes, they do.
If the stock market is rising and rising and rising, the people are getting richer. And, their very means of measuring that is obviously very distorted, which is what the Fed does. Yeah. But everybody feels richer, and yet they're actually not richer. All they're doing is it's just another creative outlet to incentivize capital destruction.
All right, Keith, we're going to have to leave it go at that. Keith, we're basically out of time already, and I'm very sorry about that because I wanted to get on to have you talk a little bit more about your products and how people can actually earn a reasonable yield on their gold holdings. We'll have to do that another time. But again, folks, you really need to go to monetary-metals.com, monetarymetals.com. Go there to read, and I would really suggest that you read the heat death of the economic universe, which Keith was just alluding to. Very insightful, I think, in terms of helping relate the real world to what's going on in economics. Keith, I want to thank you so much for being with us again, and I hope we can do it again sometime in the near future.
All right, thanks for having me.